To begin, if you're familiar with the Geena Davis Institute, you know our tagline: if they can see it, they can be it. And you hear the reality of this statement all the time. Every week, I'll listen to a podcast, I'll see a social media post, or I'll hear someone say something that reminds me of the power of this very simple phrase. So many of us have people, athletes, or actors in film and television that make us feel seen. Our own research at the Institute has found that Dana Scully from the X-Files, there's many of today's scientists were inspired by her, and that an entire generation of archers were galvanized by Katniss Everdeen's character in The Hunger Games, and that young girls of color in particular found Shuri and Riri Williams from the Wakanda Forever incredibly inspiring. So, do you have a see it, be it character? Maybe you have several. I asked some of our team members at the Institute to tell me who their see it, be it characters were, and this collage is reflective of some of those characters. But many people have yet to feel seen, and they're still waiting for the story that makes them feel seen, valued, understood, or inspired. Earlier today on this stage, Kaylee Reese, who starred recently in True Detective, she mentioned that for her as a Native woman, she didn't feel seen until Edward Scissorhands. She said it very funny. You should go back and watch that. She was explaining, as an Indigenous woman, she didn't have a character that she identified with. And Edward Scissorhands, as someone who was, stood out as being, outside or an outsider, that she identified with that character. And I was sitting in the audience when she said that, and I said, I have to mention this because it demonstrates that for some people, they are desperately searching for their character to be seen. And sometimes they have to rely on Edward Scissorhands to feel seen. So knowing that the power of portrayal, our goal at the Geena Davis Institute is to drive industry change by providing data and insights to executives, directors, and other creatives that they can take and that they can use to move the needle on how people from marginalized communities are seen on screen. So that's what we do. And the big screen matters. A recent study by the Center for Scholars and Storytellers found, quote, movies remain teens' top choice for entertainment. When asked what they would do if time and money were no constraint, going to see a movie came out on top, far ahead of other activities, close quote. Yes, so I know for a lot of people in the entertainment industry, you love to see a statistic like this. Yes, teens and adolescents still are going to the movies and they want to see movies. So let's get to the study. A brief statement about our methodology. So what we have here is an analysis of family films. This is G, PG, and PG-13 films from 2013 with a budget over $10 million that originated or were distributed in the US. And this is all from 2023. And this is according to Illuminate and Film, a database by Variety. So altogether, it's 82 films are in this data set. All right, so now for our key findings. So speaking of see it and be it, we find that women and girls are about 38% of characters on screen in these films. Yeah, so far less visible than men on screen. When we look at race, we see 41% of characters were people of color, just 1.5% were identified as LGBTQIA, 2% had a disability, 6.5% had a large body type, and 19% were 50 plus. I'll return to how gender intersects with some of these identities in a minute. So at different levels of prominence, we see some variation, but not a lot. So as I mentioned, all characters, women are about 38%. Of leads, they're just 35% of leads. Among notable supporting, 44% of characters are women, so somewhat more visible as notable supporting, and then 37% of supporting roles and 36% of minor roles are given to women and girls. So while women are underrepresented overall as leads by quite a bit, we have some interesting analysis if we look at the budget of the film. So as you can see from this slide, that films with a budget between 20 and 50 million, female leads are much more visible. They're about 52% of leads of films from with the budget of that range. Starkly, you can see films with the highest budget and the lowest budget are almost 3 out of 4 leads are men. The finding that male leads are dominating these big budget films is especially glaring, especially because in our sample of 82 films, 26 of them had a budget over 100 million. So it's even more egregious. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit more about how women are shown. So for this intersectional analysis, we were interested in whether or not men and women possess marginal identities to a similar degree. What we found is that female characters are more often people of color than male characters. So essentially 47% of women on screen are people of color compared to 36% of men on screen. And then this will come as no surprise to most people in here. Men are much more likely to be 50 and older on screen. So 21% of male characters were 50 plus compared to just 14% of women. So we're seeing far fewer older women on screen than older men. At the Institute, we actually have a few studies that and reports dedicated to the essentially erasure of women 50 and older on screen that I'd encourage you to go and look up. So at this, among male leads of color and women leads of color, among leads, we see that 37% of male leads are men of color compared to 35% of female leads are women of color. So a similar share of leads for male and female characters are people of color, but I want to pause for a minute because as you heard earlier, 47% of women on screen are people of color. So the fact that only 36% of leads are women of color suggests that as leads, women of color are under-indexed. And we also were interested in what these characters are motivated by. This is something, one of the great things about working with Geena Davis is she gives me ideas. And one of the things that she really wanted to look at were what are the characters motivated by? And I'll tell you a little bit about some of the motivations we looked for. When you watch a movie, someone's trying to save the world or save their families. Some people want love or sex. Those were the motivations that we were looking for. We did not observe statistically significant differences in male and female characters' motivations. So this suggests to us that that narrative trends may be shifting towards more gender equality. And so we found this to be a positive finding. Maybe some of these stories are subverting these tropes. You love to see the damsel in distress trope flipped. Anyway, I recently watched a movie and saw it, and it's just delightful. A little bit of a surprise. She saved herself. Who would have thought? Okay, another variable we looked at was sexual objectification. It doesn't come up often in family films, but when it does, women are 5 times more likely to be sexually objectified and 3 times as likely to be in sexually revealing clothing. Films play a significant role in how we understand ourselves and understand the world. And unfortunately, even if this were equal, there are different societal impacts on sexualization of women than on men. Psychological research finds that when women are sexually objectified, it contributes to their dehumanization. And we don't see those same social impacts on men. So, these, like I said, this doesn't happen very often, but we're still seeing a big difference. But even if we don't, we know that, the effects of objectification on men and women are just different. We also looked at how characters are shown and whether or not they're shown working. We did find that men are more likely to have an occupation on screen, but that there were no differences in terms of leadership, that male and female characters are shown as leaders to a similar degree. But there were a few occupational differences that were interesting that do reinforce gender stereotypes. So men are 2 times as likely to have a career in the armed forces or the military on screen, and 3 times as likely to have a career in sports. However, encouragingly, we do see that when female characters do have an occupation, they are more likely to be in STEM than men. And we have a few studies that look at women in STEM. So for us, this is encouraging that we are seeing more women in STEM. Okay, so you're about to hear from our amazing panel, and they're going to no doubt have many concrete, real recommendations for you all to take today. But I thought I'd just cover a few things. So first, cast female leads in these high-budget films. We know they perform well. We have evidence of one just last weekend. And we need to challenge these outdated stereotypes about what audiences want and what audiences demand. So we need more women starring in these $100 million and higher budget films. Cast female actors in roles written for men. There are so many times, many of you are writers, you write this character and in your head, it might be a man. And if someone just asks you to think, why does it need to be? Flipping some of these roles could actually maybe lead to a more interesting or fascinating portrayal. Write female characters with interests beyond romance and their physical appearance, and broaden the range of occupations shown for male and female characters, especially to flip some of people's expectations and their, these norms about who should do what. All right, with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ellie Austin, the editorial director for Most Powerful Women at Fortune, and she's going to introduce our panel. Thank you, everybody.
So much to Dr. Conroy for those statistics, which we're going to dig into in a second, with the following three very esteemed panelists, who are Madeline Di Nonno, who is the president and CEO of the Geena Davis Institute, which obviously just produced the research we've been talked through. Hello, Mad. Janine Jones-Clark, EVP, Filmmaker and Content Strategies at Universal Filmed Entertainment Group. And last but not least, Ramsey Nato, president of Nickelodeon and Paramount Animation.
Yep. Unless you don't want to sit.
You can snuggle up on the couch. So there's a lot to dig into, but I want to start off by getting each of your reactions to what we've just heard from Dr. Conroy. And Madeline, maybe we'll start with you, your reaction to the research, and also something that surprised you, either good or bad.
So we were expecting a decline in the overall percentage of female characters because you have to look at market conditions, and this is where Janine and Ramsey can give more context. I mean, the entertainment industry is going through the great contraction. When you think about a pandemic and 2 strikes, their theatrical slates have been annihilated. And in fact, Janine, who also serves on our board of directors, you know, we had a conversation with her and some of our other partners, and we're like, look, we put our film study on hold because we thought it would be kind of dangerous to put Geena's name on a diversity, equity, inclusion report given the market conditions. And so we put it on hold for a few years, and then we said, well, how did you feel about 2023? And she said, well, I feel okay about it. So we only looked at 2023. So this report is not being compared to when pre-pandemic, when we hit parity for female lead characters in TV and then, you know, in film. So we expected, you know, that, you know, decline. However, when you look at agency, what we were really pleased is that, you know, 3 and 4 films did pass the Bechdel test. And so this sense of, you know, some of the tropes about the damsel in distress, et cetera, we didn't see that being, you know, perpetuated. So, you know, that was really positive.
Do you want to just briefly explain? I'm sure most people in the room know what the Bechdel test is for anyone who isn't familiar with it.
Yeah, so Dr. Alison Bechdel created this test, and the composition is there has to be 2 female characters, they have to be speaking to each other, and they have to be speaking to each other about other than men, you know, or a romantic, you know, situation. And so we were pleased, you know, actually to see that.
Mm-hmm. Janine, your reaction and something that surprised you.
Okay, let's see. And to echo what Madeline said, she's absolutely correct in the sense that, you know, because of different circumstances between the pandemic and between the different strikes, it has severely impacted our slates and the volume of films that we can put out. So if that's impacted, then our representation across the board is impacted. So my initial thought was, okay, it's not as terrible as I thought, but gosh, we have a lot more work to do. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what fuels me to do what I and my team continue to do. The partnership we have with the Geena Davis Institute is incredible because I look to it as a source of accountability. Mm-hmm. And we need that as content creators. Having that accountability check is so important for everything from who we cast in front of the camera, who's behind the camera, and the narrative itself. Mm-hmm. So the last thing my lasting feeling always, and it's not just specifically to this study, is when I don't see equity or more of a balance, it just tells me more work to be done.
Mm-hmm. And I want to come back in a second to the specific things that you're doing, but Ramsey, first of all, I want to get your perspective.
I mean, I feel the same way as both of you. You know, when I see the research, I'm not surprised, but I'm also incredibly inspired and motivated to keep the door open for women in the future. for people of color, for diversity and inclusion, and moving forward. There is so much work to do, but I'm so inspired by the many women leaders in animation specifically who are there, leading the charge and creating change.
And you mentioned, we were chatting just backstage, that 70% of animation students at the moment are women. What does keeping the door open look like so that those women transition out of their studies and build really successful careers in the industry?
I mean, it is such a different world today. That is such an incredible stat for women in animation.
It's huge.
That 70% of animation students are women. So they are entering animation in a really big way. At a time where, the leadership numbers and the retention numbers are not great. So for me, I feel like it really shines the light on what is our culture doing to welcome women into the workplace, to engage with women, and to create career paths that are, for many years to come, and with a goal of leadership role, right? Because women are not holding leadership roles like they should.
Janine, what can leaders in this room, you can clap for sure. What can leaders in this room, leaders beyond this room, do to help women get to those leadership positions so that they're making the decisions about the types of family films that are being made?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, and I'm just going to lean into your line, if you can see it, you can be it. And I think a lot of people don't have a certain awareness of all the different career paths that you can go to and explore. I think that's important, more exposure, giving more of an understanding and education to people of what paths there are. I mean, when I got out of college, I had no idea I'd be where I am right now. But you find, and this is the second part, strong mentorship. And that mentorship helps guide you to get there. I think that's really important. But I think in terms of being a female leader, particularly within Universal, I find it's my responsibility to inspire that next generation of leaders and help them and guide them so that they can navigate. Because it is tricky. I mean, yeah, I'm kind of a dinosaur. I've been around for a while. I've been the only female at the table many times in my career, and it's not a great feeling. So when you get to the point where you can actually empower and help others, that really does make me feel good. I also, last thing I'll just kind of say, I think Universal is a very unique situation. We are led by, to me, just one of the most phenomenal leaders in this industry, Donna Langley. She hired me 8 years ago, to create what was then the first of its kind DEI team for film. And she had the forethought to see that before it became a thing per se. But you look at how the rest of our company is populated. If you have Donna in that position, we have Perlina, who is head of UTV. You have Margie Cohen, who's head of DreamWorks. We've got Veronica Kwan Vandenberg, who's head of international distribution. You see a lot of female leaders at the table, and I feel like that's important. And what I can see over the time I've been there is just an increase in us having a voice in the creative process. I mean, about 4 years ago, I was invited to be part of the Greenlight, which is incredible, to be a part of those decisions.
And talking about the creative process, Madeline, one of the statistics that jumped out of me was the decline in the number of female leads in family films. So I think in 2019, it was about 48%. And now it's about 35%. So obviously we've talked about the pandemic being a key factor in this, but if you take the temperature of society as a whole, I think we're more engaged in conversations about diversity and inclusion. How do you attribute that decline? Is it just the pandemic, or are there other factors at play that we should be aware of?
Well, it wasn't just the pandemic, you had 2 strikes. I mean, really, to me, it's market conditions. And you can come back to me in 2 years and say, I was right or I was wrong, but really, really market conditions on a global basis. Also, guess what we learned during the pandemic, we learned to read subtitles. And so therefore, big streamers like Netflix didn't have to make a lot of original programming. They could just do wonderful acquisitions from Korea or Sweden. And guess what? We would read the subtitles. So you have to look at so many different factors that contributed to that. But to me, it's really about marketing conditions because, Paramount Global is a major supporter. They haven't backed off. NBC Universal has been a longtime supporter. They haven't backed off. Sony, others. And so, we still have the strength of our partners.
And explain a bit what it means to be a great partner and, not to have backed off. What does that look like tangibly?
Well, we're a B2B, we're not a B2C. You're never going to see our logo on a cereal box. If any of you want to, we will be glad to do that. But so we really depend on the partners. And so, for example, Janine was the first person to raise her hand when she heard we have this tool called Spell Check for Bias, which is a little AI, some machine learning, and a whole lot of big brain Dr. Conroy and her team. And it looks at scripts. And because it's an intervention, how do you fix things on the front end versus the back end? And you can add more to this. And they embraced it and they use it. And it's a great, tool for them. So that's what it is about partnership, because we've been around 20 years. We wouldn't be here if it wasn't for the support of Ramsey, Paramount Global, Janine and NBC Universal.
Mm-hmm. And Janine, you mentioned the DEI department that you founded when you first came into university, I believe.
Yep.
Does that still exist, or has it been sort of dispersed and embedded across the company now? What does that look like?
I like to say NBC Universal on the film side decided a new strategy to double down, which I think is really effective. So GTDI, as it was, does not exist.
And what does that stand for, GTDI?
Oh, sorry. That was my branding people who ingrained that in my head. Global Talent Development and Inclusion. And I named the department that because, one, I felt like inclusiveness is beyond what we have just domestically, so global was very important to me. And inclusion was also important because I think there's so much in terms of representation and intersectionality that, you have to have an open lens, and I didn't want to narrow it. So that was Global Talent Development and Inclusion. This year, top of this year, and it was a department, mind you, that started with myself, my colleague Emerlyn Lampetok, and 2 admin, grew to be about 20 individuals, which was amazing because it became almost like a launch pad of sorts where we could attack representation from multiple areas. We did it within our work culture. We did it within writing, directing. We also were focused on our partners, such as Geena Davis Institute, animation writers, composers, below the line. So you get the gist, it grew. And what I think is so brilliant about Donna and Peter Kramer, my boss, their leadership is they saw that it would be incredibly effective to take this big department and embed it in the respective businesses. So now I'm part of production development, where my group focuses on writers, directors, actors, everything on above the line. We work closely with all of our term deal producers, and any of the content that the studio creates, we're involved in it from green light all the way up to, to the point where it gets to distribution. So that, and with that specificity, that allows us to really focus and give, like I like to call it, a white glove service, if you will, as opposed to being a generalist where you're all over. Then the other part formed a new department, which is the Universal Talent Development and Inclusion Department. It's run by my colleague Brandon Williams, who is a fantastic part of our work culture force, and all of the below the line and more physical production initiatives landed over there. Sorry, it was long-winded.
No, that's fascinating. And out of all those areas that you've just named, below the line, above the line, what's proving trickiest to find progress with?
Well, the trickiest was directors. And I come from television, years in television, and breaking an episodic director, I'm not going to say was easy, but I felt like it happened on a more of a regular basis. I mean, it's different. The odds are different. You have a producer who's attached to a series who can pretty much, and a directing producer, I mean, who can guarantee the consistency on how it comes out. So you're going to take a chance more so on a director who's unproven, whereas on film, it's a director's medium. So that one's been the hardest one to crack, but I think, fingers crossed, I challenged one of my team members one day. I walked into her office and I said, look, okay, I'm really results driven. I don't like to do anything just because. I'm like, where are we driving the change? And I said, this isn't really working. We're not getting the results we need to get on this. Let's rethink it. You don't have to give me an answer today, but I'll come see you tomorrow. And she puts up with me. I don't know why. But she really, this is Emerlyn, who really leaned in, and we came up with this idea. It's called No Drama. And it's really the basis of our new strategy, where we're no longer creating larger corporate programs. We are curating initiatives based on what our filmmakers are looking for. So we knew Jordan Peele is looking for genre directors and content. So we are funding, with our partners, the Toronto International Film Festival, these short films that these 5 filmmakers we selected are going to make. This is why I'm excited about it, because they're going to make these short films. They're going to premiere at TIFF. We have a first look on them. But Jordan's so invested because this is talent he was looking for, that the hope is one gets pushed into development. That's the new direction we're headed in.
That's such a good pipeline. Ramsey, I want to talk a bit about research that Nickelodeon has done around how children feel about what they're seeing on TV screens. So I think that Nickelodeon has stats, as I believe it, showing that about 50 to 60% of children under 12 years old in the US are children of color, and yet the Geena Davis research shows that only about 36% of leads are characters of color in the films analyzed. So those figures don't add up. Why do you think we have that disparity? And I guess a basic question is it harder to get a family film starring a child of color or a family of color greenlit than it would be a white family?
Well, first of all, I think the world is so different than the world I grew up in the 70s. Thank God. It's more inclusive. I love that stat that kids under the age of 12 are, more diverse than ever. It is a real motivator to change, to look at our practice, the way that we are, engaging with the industry, with creators, telling stories, building characters, embracing thematics. It's really inspiring. It's why I love research so much, because it just identifies blind spots that we have and allows us to grab hold of opportunity. So at Nickelodeon, we did this research called Shades of Us. We started about 5 years ago. And the goal of the research was to engage with kids and families around shows that they were watching and to ask them, did they like their representation? And there was a lot to love, but there was a lot to learn. And what we learned was that kids don't love their representation, that they didn't feel like it was authentic, it was fresh, it was of today. If I had to be candid, more times than not, perpetuated stereotype that made them disengage. That is exactly what we don't want at Nickelodeon. So that was an opportunity. It allowed us to look at our practice, look at how we're engaging with consultants. It allowed us to look at how we're putting our characters and our stories in front of people to get real responses, with an eye towards telling stories about real kids in extraordinary situations that have real meaning. And that has proven to be, that has created a lot of change for us. That has, lent itself to a great new Dora series.
What kind of change does that translate to in terms of the animations that you're putting on screen?
Well, it means that we are looking at who is behind the screen. Who are our showrunners, who are our writers, who is our voice talent that's adding to the authenticity of what we're making. It has, challenged our hiring practice to make sure that we are being inclusive, that we're not relying on old lists, and that we're open to a new generation of voices.
One thing that strikes me when I go to the cinema, as I would say, or the movie theater, as you guys would say in America, is that a lot of family films rely on pre-existing IP, whether it's Paddington or Moana or Mufasa, the Lion King spin-off that we're going to see later this month, I think. What impact does that pre-existing IP have on diversity, if any? Madeline, maybe to you.
Well, I'll answer it from my perspective, and then obviously Janine and Ramsey. So, when you have legacy IP, there are vigilant fans of it, and there's only so far you can go with characters, and that's why reimagination, reinterpretation, prequels, sequels allows studio partners to add and enhance while protecting the legacy of that IP. The other thing is from a budget deficit. If you own it and you don't have to pay for it to be developed, it's a lot cheaper. You're not paying hundreds of thousands of dollars for an original script when you're just, reimagining something that you own. So there is, that kind of like budget efficacy, as well.
Mm-hmm. Anything you two want to add?
I mean, I look at it from a creative perspective, and I think it depends on the IP, but I like to think we see opportunity, and I use Wicked as an example where Cynthia Erivo, brilliant casting that Mark Platt and John Chu brought together. I also can look at DreamWorks and the IP of How to Train Your Dragon, and America Ferrara cast a voice. So I feel like it really depends on what the IP is, and I like to think that our creative execs and our casting execs across the board look for opportunities on how to, approach some of this IP that maybe at one time is like kind of had, it's been on a shelf, okay, and give it a new perspective. And I think that casting and fresh casting is an opportunity.
Madeline, one element that was really interesting in Dr. Conroy's presentation was the budget. So she said that female leads are more common among films with a budget of 20 to 50 million, where they have 51.9% of leads. Can you explain to us a bit why that category of budget, as it were, is more equitable than others?
Well, when you think about, and it's so wonderful when you look at Wicked has done 360 million in 10 days,
Huge.
and Moana has done 221 million dollars like over the weekend. It's great to say that we've already hopefully blown through, that kind of number. So, I just think it just really, depends on, the slates and the timing. A lot of it is timing too. When you think about it, it could take 10 years for one animated film, to come out. And when it comes to film, TV can be so prolific, and you could just churn it out. But again, not with a film. Look how many years it took for them to make, to Wicked, and I'm sure Moana as well. It's could be 24, 25 months or so.
And that's a really good point, because some people will say, oh, look at the success of Barbie. Why aren't we seeing immediate change in the statistics off the back of that? Well, that trickle-down effect is going to take years, hopefully. We are going to feel it, but we're not going to feel it tomorrow in what we're seeing on our screens. We're talking obviously about family films here a lot in the statistics, but I want to acknowledge the broader picture of the film industry and how the representation that you've noticed in the analysis compares to all the other genres across the film industry. Is the representation on par, above, below? Any thoughts you have on that?
Well, we strictly stick to G, PG, and PG-13. Unfortunately, there were no G-rated films in 2023. And again, hopefully we'll see that when the market kind of corrects itself. So, those are pretty much what we look at. But, when you think about it, it's great to see that family films are so strong, because it's a very large audience, because they have to buy multiple tickets, because the parents and the children, there's a repeatability, and it's something for the whole family to watch. And I think Wicked and Moana, demonstrated that beautifully. There was something for everyone.
Why were there no G-rated films I know you say market conditions, but is there anything in particular that points to that?
Not that we could, not that
Okay.
we would know about. Like,
Okay.
we'll have to circle back.
We'll come back
next
to
year.
that.
Yeah.
Okay, Janine and Ramsey, obviously we have an administration coming into office who, to put it mildly, is probably not going to make DEI a priority, and I wonder how you continue with the work that you're doing against the political backdrop that we would anticipate over the next 4 years.
Do you want to go first?
I know that's a big question, so punt it between the three of you.
I would pivot and say, and respond to something that you guys were talking about, and that was what's tricky. And what I find tricky often in my role, even though I started as a PA, and I moved up and became leadership, is my engagement with everyone from the PA up and down. And around this type of subject matter, it's like we can be in an ivory tower. It's very easy to be in an ivory tower, but not engage with the crews that are making your shows. And like you said, in animation, it can take 2 years, 6 years to make an animated film, and there's a lot of change that can happen around over the course of a film. And so one of the things that I'm really proud of is the creation of the Nickelodeon Pledge that we created, which was a commitment to hiring, underrepresented people behind the camera with an eye towards authenticity on screen. And this pledge cascaded through 60 of our productions, and as you can imagine, the SpongeBob pledge was very different than the Casagrandes pledge. But what they all had in common was a dialogue around change, looking at our systemic processes towards everything, looking at roles as a way to represent the audience that we're trying to touch, stories, thematics, and it was incredible. And it was, in terms of results, was meaningful and heartfelt, and had lots of soul, but really moved the needle in terms of engagement and people feeling like they were invited into a dialogue that sometimes is not easy to participate in.
Yeah, so it was a really good conversation starter, and then it's about translating it into action.
Right.
One thing I want to acknowledge from the research before we run out of time is the disability figures, because they really jumped out at me as being very low. So if we think that the US population comprises about 27.2% of people with disabilities, the study says that only 2% of characters in family films portrayed with disabilities. How can we improve that representation? When will we see the star of a big family film who has disabilities that maybe children in the audience can relate to?
Well, one thing you should know is that people with disabilities are 25% of movie goers. So you are leaving money on the table. And I do want to give a big compliment to Wicked, who is very, very intentional on how they portrayed disabilities and with a lead character. And you could talk more about it, but it was obvious, it was intentional. They made sure the DP was like right on it.
Yep.
So I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about that.
I mean, the commitment for Wicked, it was there even in pre-production. So this is a little over 2 years ago when the executive producer reached out and wanted me to take a look at a casting breakdown to make sure the breakdown was appropriately worded as we were casting Nessa Rose. Then we took it a step further where we wanted to really get a perspective from one of our partners within the disability community, and we leaned into, it was then called Respectability. They've rebranded as Disability Belongs, I believe. And they read the script, and they gave like very thoughtful notes and feedback. And here's a big win, because you never know. All you can do is provide the information. But we did a screening of Wicked, and the individual who read the script from Disability Belongs was so excited because she saw suggestions that she had made incorporated in the film. And the intentionality in representation goes across the board because we had a disability coordinator on set. It was really important to John Chu that Visually, the way the set was designed, that the audience could organically see how Nessa Rose would navigate it in a natural way. So I think it was just handled in such a thoughtful way at multiple levels. It's just a win. That film makes me smile, just because I look at John directing, I look at the casting, I look at just the beautiful visual world of it, and so on and so on. I don't have to, but I'm super proud of that.
As you should be. As you should be. To close, I'd love to hear from you all if there's one character or storyline that you would love to see portrayed on screen in the next few years, in family films or not in family films, that you feel would represent real progress.
I can refer to a project that I am completely in love with on our development slate, which is the retelling of Swan Lake. And it is a story about a friendship between two girls that go on an adventure for the truth. And while they find the truth, they also begin to understand the complexities of what good and evil is, which allows them to overcome, I don't know, like the biggest challenge imaginable, which leads to love and acceptance and friendship in a way that only comes with wisdom and experience in life. But it is a story about women. It is young girls becoming women, which I think is really exciting and empowering.
Okay, well, we can't wait for that, whenever it appears. Anything from you, Janine or Madeline? I know it's hard.
Off the top of my head, I mean, I think for me, anytime I look at material we're considering, I just look for the strong female. And like, if the female is not shaped in a way where I feel it's empowering strength, avoiding stereotypes and tropes, I'm going to speak up.
And what does that mean, like in her dialogue and her storyline? How does that strength translate? Like, what specifically are you looking for? Is it her dialogue? Is it the way she interacts with other characters?
It's an attitude. It's
an
dialogue.
Attitude.
It's how she chooses to populate her world and how she takes on that world. She's not in the kitchen all the time or taking the kids. Nothing wrong with taking the kids to school, but she does that and.
Yeah, she's very multifaceted. She's got a lot to do.
Yeah, absolutely.
Madeline, anything from you to close on?
Well, yeah, I think if there's more female characters over the age of 50 that are shown fit and having sex and having a full life and not being domesticated, I'd love to see more of that. Quite frankly, and I think for the LGBTQIA community, it can't be about the identity. They have families, they are leaders. So I'd like to see more of that.
That's a good one.
Madeline, Janine, and Ramsey, thank you so much for being here, and thank you for your amazing work as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.